Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey, and on this episode, I'm joined by Chris Havey. Chris is a partner working out of the Woodlands, Texas office. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. Happy to be here.
So, compensation committees typically are very busy in the first quarter and the fourth quarter of the year. As one fiscal year ends and the next one begins, committees must determine incentive payouts for the prior year. They must set incentive targets and goals for the next year and prepare for proxy disclosures and say on pay. The Q1 and the Q4 committee meetings are often very full and critical to success, but what about the rest of the year? While agendas are often lighter in the second and third quarter meetings, this is often a great time to address strategic issues that influence critical pay decisions. If a committee plans an effective off-season agenda, it can set itself up for success throughout the year. So today we're going to discuss some of those key issues that effective committees are addressing in the off-season. So Chris, I'd like to start really just kind of outlining at a high level what are some of those key items that you think effective committees should be considering in those Q2 and those Q3 meetings.
Yeah, Ryan. So as you mentioned, I think it's a good time for more thoughtful discussion about some of these more strategic issues. You've got a little bit more time. You're not rushed to get something out and get something decided and done. So my top five would be, assessing whether incentives are reinforcing the compensation strategy, testing whether your incentive payouts are aligned with performance. Three is understanding where your program design deviates from market. Four, understanding potential liabilities and risks within the compensation programs. And the last one is evaluating the external communications about the compensation programs and whether they are achieving the goals that you want to achieve.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I can see there's a a consistent theme across all of these, that these are not necessarily action items. So we're not, you're typically not asking the committee to make a decision in those Q2, Q3 meetings, but these are really opportunities to kind of dive deeper, almost philosophically, into some of these things that set us up for decisions that are going to have to be made later in the year.
That's right. It's a lot of assessing and testing and understanding, not a lot of deciding.
Yep. Yep. So let's dive into the first. I think you outlined five critical areas. So let's start with reviewing of the strategic alignment of incentives. How would you suggest committees approach that in the off season?
Yeah. So this is a pretty basic kind of fundamental 101 piece of executive compensation design: is do the programs align and reinforce the strategy that we're trying to accomplish as a company. But often we get so focused on going through the process, making sure we're not in trouble with proxy advisors, making sure we're aligned with competitive practices. This is an opportunity to just kind of step back and ask, do these incentives align and drive the right behaviors that we want to drive? Do they reinforce our strategy? And that reinforcement is both, do they reinforce the participants or the employees, but also externally, do these align with what we're saying to our investors, and do they demonstrate to our investors that we are, putting our money where our mouth is? So usually what that entails is just kind of going through each of the incentive programs and each of the metrics and saying, how do these reinforce our strategy? How do they reinforce the behaviors that we want to drive? It doesn't have to be a direct connection. For example, if your goal is to expand into a new service area, doesn't mean you have to have new service revenues as a metric, but you want to make sure that whatever metrics you do have are positively impacted by expanding into the new service, and that if you progress on that strategy of expanding into a new service area, it will play out in the goals that you've set. I also think this is particularly important if your strategy is evolving, obviously. Making sure that you understand the metrics. If our strategy is evolving, the metrics need to evolve as well. So that's another key point. And like I said, this is pretty basic kind of Comp 101, but sometimes we lose sight of it in just the day-to-day blocking and tackling and getting stuff done. And the summer months are a great time to kind of reevaluate and step back from a more philosophical level.
Yep. Yep. Well, and on that point, philosophical level, there's kind of a layer that not every company has, but I think it can be a very effective layer. And the clients that I work with that do this, we find this very helpful, which is to periodically review that comp philosophy. And it kind of goes along with what you're talking about here of that strategic alignment. for most companies, everybody says they have a comp philosophy. They state it in their CDNA.
Right.
For the vast majority, if you read one philosophy to the next, they sound almost the same. They talk about motivating and retaining and competitive, having competitive programs. What I'd like to see though is that next layer down, which kind of gets at what you're talking about, which is taking some of those big philosophical statements, which do tend to be the same because companies are trying to do the same types of things. But then what are the guiding principles of how you're going to get there? And those guiding principles are often what ties back to the business strategy. So
Right.
this is all, if you go to that step and kind of create those guiding principles, this is a nice interface too of let's reevaluate. A lot of times those guiding principles aren't going to change from year to year, but they might. And do they still align with the strategy? And then the next layer down is, okay, how do those impact all the things you were just talking about, incentive metrics, incentive design, whatnot. So,
Right.
yeah.
Exactly right.
So why don't we jump into the second area that you outlined, which was performance alignment and reviewing that alignment. And we've talked about performance alignment a lot on this podcast. It's obviously an important factor throughout the year for committees. But what are some of the things that committees you think should be really evaluating in the off season around performance alignment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the philosophical underpinnings that you just mentioned was we want to pay for performance, and almost everybody has that in their proxy statement and their philosophy. And so this is just, testing whether that's playing out how we think it should. And there's some analysis you can do to kind of bring to the table to help test those assumptions. But at a high level is kind of comparing performance, and there's different ways we can measure performance, and there's probably some important performance measures we want to look at there, and whether that aligns with actual payouts from our incentive programs over the long term. And this also ties back to that strategy discussion, because that might inform what measures of performance we want to include in this analysis. If we're focused on growth, maybe we want to have some growth performance measures. If we're focused on returns, we want to have returns measures in there. And certainly you can build in other measures like total shareholder return and something like that that's more high level. But that's basically what it is: measuring performance, measuring payouts, and see if there's alignment. This is more informational. It's not about testing whether they're exactly aligned. You're at the 67th percentile of one and the 67th percentile of the other. It's just directionally, are we aligned on an overall basis? It's not meant to be super precise.
Yep. Yep. And I find doing this type of analysis this time of year, it's a nice balance to later in the year when so much emphasis is on, traditional total compensation benchmarking. Everything's about targeted pay levels, where, like you said, this is more about actual pay levels and how do they align versus performance. So it's a nice thing to do at this time of the year to kind of balance some of that other, benchmarking analysis will happen later.
Right. It certainly distinguishes it from the total compensation benchmarking that's on targets. So it's a completely separate analysis. You have the data from the proxies that you can use if you want to do a relative analysis. It's a really good time to kind of have that conversation without a lot of pressure of we need to make action. This is just informational at this point.
Yep. Yep. So let's jump to number 3. I think you talked about market comparisons, and we just mentioned benchmarking. There's a lot of benchmarking that happens later in the year, but what are some of the market comparisons, some of the benchmarking that committees might want to do in those off-season months?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a time where proxies are out, so you have good data on program design. So incentive structures, both short-term and long-term, severance programs, employment agreements, things like that. And some of those you might not look at every year, but there's probably an opportunity to have a regular market review to say, where are we aligned with market practices on these, and where are we not? And does that make sense for us and align with our culture and strategy? So again, bringing it back to the strategy. Where do we want to differentiate ourselves from our competitors? And is that playing out in how our incentive designs are compared to our peers? So for example, if everybody in your peer group uses EPS, but you use something else, EBITDA or return on capital, does that align with how you want to differentiate yourself against your competitors? We want to be more return focused, so we want to use return on capital, while our competitors are using EPS because they're more growth focused. So that's just kind of, again, an informational analysis that you can do now to kind of set the stage for those discussions around the program design heading into the next year.
Yep. Yep. And having having an opportunity to have kind of multiple discussions around some of those things before, if you are going to make a design change later in the year, having multiple meetings where those discussions happen is often very, very effective. A lot better than coming in at the 11th hour with a design change that hasn't been discussed. So.
Exactly.
So I think you for the fourth category, you use the term comprehensive review. So a comprehensive review of understanding kind of the liabilities, the risks of programs. What exactly do you mean by that, and how would you suggest committees go about doing that?
Yeah, so we're looking at like potential liabilities and risks for the company or for the committee in the future. So as some examples, we've seen situations where there isn't just this comprehensive understanding from the committee or management on how all the compensation components fit to each other, what happens upon various events. These are complex programs. It's hard to keep it all straight. So, as an example, what's the treatment of equity upon retirement? If we terminate this executive without cause, what are they entitled to? And so the summer months, again, are a good time to kind of make sure that everybody understands the terms of the various programs. This can be done via tally sheet. That's a pretty common approach, or a program summary that just kind of outlines the treatment of various programs upon various events. And this is a helpful tool just to put in front of the committee now, but also keep in front of them on a regular basis, whether it's in an appendix to the meetings, or if you have an information repository on their online tool that they have access to, and then you just kind of update it once a year during the summer months. The advantage of doing this now and also just keeping it in front of them is that if a sensitive situation comes up in the future and the committee doesn't want to ask management about how a plan works for sensitivity reasons, it's documented out there. They have that information handy to them to say, oh yeah, if we did terminate the CFO or the CEO, this would be the result, or if this individual retires, we know how that's going to be treated. And so we can react to that. So just having it all out there in one place, again, summer months is a great time to do this because you're just not as busy with the other pieces of the compensation process.
Yep. Yep. No, great time for this. And, I think probably most committee members are familiar with the term tally sheet and may even get those, annually. Not always familiar with like everything you just described. Like why are we getting this tally sheet? Well, it's to have that comprehensive review and a little bit of history there that really grew out of I can recall, I think it was almost 20 years ago, there was a relatively high profile company that the CEO departed, and I think it was like $140 million roughly payment that was being made related to the retirement. But the decisions that the committee made that led to that 140 million were made over the entire career of the CEO, kind of in silos. And it was clear at the time that no one really had ever seen everything all added up together until they finally made the decision that the CEO was departing. So
Right.
that was the genesis of a lot of the tally sheets and everything you just described, Chris. Is really around avoiding those kinds of surprises for a board.
Right.
Yeah. So let's get into, I think, the final thing you mentioned, which was really around external communications and engaging with shareholders. Now, we've had conversations about engaging with shareholders on the podcast before, and definitely want to hear your thoughts about how we approach that in the off season, but also just proxy disclosure itself. Often, you get through the proxy season and you just take a deep breath, and companies don't think about it again until they get a couple months out from the next proxy. But there's probably some things you can be doing well in advance to get ready for that season. So tell us about all of that. What should companies be thinking about external outreach and communications?
Yeah, well, so again, a few thoughts here. One, this ties together all the things we just talked about, the strategy, the incentive programs, how we're thinking about the philosophy, how we pay performance. And also, as you pointed out, you just got done with the proxy, maybe want to take a few months off. But it's helpful to not wait until the proxy's a month or two away from being filed again. So kind of being proactive about that in a time where it's a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter load. So if we feel good about how the plans work and that they support the company's strategy and they align pay performance, this is an opportunity to kind of relook at the proxy when you're not stressed about just getting it out and say, making sure that all of that perspective is communicated effectively in the proxy. Maybe there's an opportunity to make it a little clearer next year on certain aspects of that, how it applies, how it aligns with our strategy, or how we pay performance, or how that has played out. It can also be done, right now you probably will have the proxy advisor reports out, and they'll have potentially feedback in there as well. So there's an opportunity to kind of build that into the process as well. What feedback do we have from them? What feedback do we have from other people that are involved in the process from our, whether it's the outside consultant or the board or the management team that we want to incorporate in the future. So
Yeah.
I think that's one aspect. I think the second aspect is, if you're really proud of like the compensation programs and how they align with the strategy, you can include that in your investor decks. I have, for example, one client that they really viewed their incentive structure as a differentiator in the market for investors. And so they incorporate a slide in their investor deck on how their incentive structure supports their strategy. Kind of, we put our money where our mouth is, and we view that as a differentiator for us. And so they had a slide on it in their investor presentations that they kind of walk through with all their investor calls.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think a previous podcast covered this, but this is a good time to work on shareholder engagement around compensation as well. It's another opportunity to maybe gather input on whether you might make changes. We talked about looking at market data, looking at the strategy. You can also look at what your feedback your investors are giving you in your shareholder engagement programs as you head into the next year. And so going through these processes can help in kind of preparing for that shareholder engagement.
Yep. Yep. No, all great thoughts. And, I mean, this is a short list. We could probably come up with another 5 things that are the good off-season items, but I think this is a good, solid list of things that committees should be thinking about. If they're not already on your agenda, probably want to add them. And if they are on your agenda, just kind of thinking through, are you giving the right level of attention, in some of those off-season months? So thanks, Chris, for joining the podcast. I think this has been a great discussion, and thanks for joining.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Ryan.